Hi, I'm Terry, and I'm here to present what I call the unified path. Now, that's a little misleading because it's not really a path. It's a perspective and it's a methodology. But in some sense, it is a path in that it is a way of looking at spiritual paths, and maybe particularly your own spiritual path. Now, why does one do that? One does that because there is something deep within us that wants to know, that wants to search for what's called awakening or enlightenment or finally knowing. This is something that's deeply within us, and for all of time, through countless generations, people have sought this, sometimes with great struggle and difficulty and deprivation. And sometimes this has just fallen on people almost as if by accident, because, as it says in the Gospels, the Spirit blows where it will. But finding this thing is all agreed the final knowledge. This is the one and only reality. It is our deepest selves. This is the nature of the true. This is the divinity. Now, with that as a prelude, how does one go about finding it? Well, let me start by saying there isn't any it to find, since in principle it's everywhere. But there is a way to open oneself up to this knowledge and to know the truth, reality, oneself. And this process is generally called mysticism. And I use that in the classical sense, that a mystic is one who knows God, who knows the truth, who knows reality personally, not conceptually, but in his own personal existential experience. Now, my own interest in this goes back to an experience I had in high school, which was a glimpse of the true that pretty much set me on a lifelong path toward finding and knowing and finally teaching these methods for knowing the true. And I went through a lot of different processes. I joined different groups. I had different meetings and correspondences with authors. And eventually I found what I thought was a wise group that I wanted to know more about. And these are a number of philosophers who wrote about the Sophia Perennis, that is the perennial wisdom that appears throughout the ages in the forms of different traditions and religions and teachings. And these philosophers who wrote about the Sophia Perennis are generally known as perennialists. And I sought them out and corresponded with them and even became friends with a couple of them. And in that process, I learned, and they insisted, that knowing the true, knowing oneself, knowing the real, knowing God, is not something that one does conceptually. It requires action. One has to do things, not simply read about them. Well, the more I looked at this group, the more desirable I thought it was, so I asked about what they were doing. Turns out they were part of a Sufi order, which I sought out and joined and spent more than 40 years in. And that was a very valuable experience where I learned a lot about myself and about God and about mystical methodology. And late in that experience, some colleagues and I decided that, well, there was in fact something missing. There was a missing element, and we couldn't figure out what it was. So we began looking around at other alternatives, and what we found was that the thing that we were missing was this action, this internal work. Not simply an idea or something as simple as a meditation or an invocation, but something to be done with that, and some way to use that experience to know ourselves in a deeper way, to know the world and to know God. And we looked around, and there were a number of things that we could choose, what finally appealed to me the most was what's called the direct path, which fills in this conceptual knowledge with self-learning in a way that one gets to inquire into one's real nature. And that's the basis of most of what I'm doing now. But all of the other elements are important. Now, other elements. Why do I say other elements? Well, part of this learning, this journey, this understanding, was to look at all of the classical, historical sages and saints from a lot of different traditions. And we all know them by their names. We know Saint Theresa, we know Rumi, we know Honan, we know Shankara, we know Meister Eckhart. All of these people are great lights and great sages. And they all have something to offer, not simply because of what they wrote, but if we look at what they did, that is what their mystical method was, what their internal spiritual work was, we find there are a number of common denominators across traditions and across cultures that are important parts of the spiritual path that need to be unified. That's why we talk about the unified path. But if we look at the history of these great saints and sages and look at the methods that they used that were given them mostly by their traditions in Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism, and across these traditions, one finds the thing about these mystical methods is they address the whole person. That is to say, they address all of our possibilities, all of our nature. Very simply, body, mind, heart, and soul. Now, they do this with different elements and in different ways. And we'll talk about those in more detail in the future. But combining these elements into a unified path, I think, is extremely important. And that's what we learn when we look back at these great lights of history. Now, in the process of coming to this conclusion, as I said, I looked at a lot of different possibilities and spiritual paths. And at one point, this was in central Ohio many years ago, I ran across someone who taught mysticism from his own experience, and it turned out to be a farmer who had been overcome by this mystical experience while planting soybeans. And he felt that driving this tractor was very much part of his awakening and his experience. And as is often, if not always the case, people who know this, who have this experience, want to speak about it. They want to tell others. They want to share. Plato says the good by its nature wants to share itself, communicate itself. So this farmer taught what he knew, and in the context of driving a tractor. That was the only time I've run into tractor driving as part of mystical methodology. But there are many similar things, and one tends to find them in the modern world. That is to say, in the world where we have so often left the whole tradition behind. And we find new approaches to spirituality, new approaches to knowing the real, such as headlessness, or the Sedona method, or the direct path, for that example. Now, one of the problems one has with these new approaches is not that they're false or not that they're wrong, because they've obviously brought someone to awakening. The problem is they tend to focus on one technique or one aspect of the person, not body, mind, and heart and soul, but generally on one aspect. The group I was with focused on the mind. We wanted to know in an intellectual sense what was true, what was right, and what was metaphysically correct. But many of these new approaches deal with other parts of our being. The only issue with that is that unlike these traditional approaches that gave us St. Francis and Rumi, they just deal with this one aspect of our being. And we need to find ways to supplement what we're doing and we know what works for us with something that helps the rest of us, because we need to address ourselves holistically, because we are whole beings, and there needs to be a place for using our body and using our mind and using our sentiments and using our activities to help us facilitate being ready for this opening. And that's what the unified path is. It's a way of looking across these parameters of being, looking across these dimensions of ourselves to find what's there, what's missing, what should be amplified, what should be minimized. And we can do that ourselves if we have some help and if we're looking in the right places. Now, those who are looking for spiritual help, for spiritual growth, can find in a number of places, both new and old. And one of the things that's more attractive about these newer approaches is that they don't have a lot of culture added to them or a lot of historical baggage. But often these new approaches, as I said, are incomplete and really only deal with part of our nature instead of being holistic approaches to spirituality and to awakening. So it is my intent to set forth here a way, a method, a knowledge that deals with the body, mind, heart, and soul, so that we can look at our own spiritual lives and decide what would be helpful, what can be amplified, and what can be minimized. Now, this is in many ways easier than taking up a whole religious tradition, which would obviously supply all of those dimensions if you can find the right tradition and the right teacher. But it's much easier to adopt these things from our current environment than it is from things that were maybe not easily accessible. And besides, we need to live our lives in such a way that we can live our lives. And if we decide, for example, that the thing I want to take up is, say, Zen Buddhism, then I would want to go to Japan, and I'd want to learn Japanese, and I'd want to read the texts in their original form, and I'd want to be in an environment where even the shape of the teacups helps my enlightenment. And that's a good idea. You can do that if you have the right connections, and if I would guess maybe you're in your 20s. But if you're 40 and have a job and a family and responsibilities, it's not likely that you can pull up your roots and completely change in order to accommodate yourself to a historical tradition. So there are many aspects to look at, there are many choices to make, and there are many things to examine. And it is my intention to set forth here in the Unified Path a way to do exactly that. And I hope we can meet back here again.